Heavy machinery tore through my backyard while I was away caring for my sick daughter. The Pinecrest HOA had built a train track right through the middle of my family's three-generation farm without permission, destroying my best crops. But I discovered something that would turn their entire world upside down. Would you believe their fancy headquarters was actually sitting on my land? I inherited my grandfather's 50-acre farm when he passed away 5 years ago. This land sits on the outskirts of what used to be rural county territory, but has slowly been engulfed by suburban development. The Pinecrest community sprang up around us over the last decade, all McMansions and manicured lawns where cornfields used to be. When they established their HOA, they tried repeatedly to force me to join, claiming my eyesore of a farm was bringing down their property values. I refused every time. This is working land that's been in my family since 1943. My grandfather built that red barn with his own hands after returning from World War II. He taught me everything I know about farming, and his legacy means more to me than any amount of money. The problem started small: complaints about my tractor being too loud in the mornings, citations for my overgrown vegetable garden that they claimed violated some county ordinance, demands to paint my barn a more appropriate color than the traditional red. I ignored them all. I wasn't part of their HOA, and they had no jurisdiction over my property. Then Rebecca Winters became the new HOA president. A polished executive in her late 30s with sleek business suits and a corporate background, she saw my farm as nothing but an obstacle to her vision of suburban perfection. During her campaign for HOA presidency, she explicitly promised to solve the farm problem and frequently brought her right-hand man, Richard Thompson, a retired corporate lawyer in his 60s, to do her dirty work. Thompson would come by with friendly suggestions about how much developers would pay for my land. He'd leave brochures for retirement communities implying a man my age shouldn't be working so hard. But this land isn't just property to me. It's my heritage, my livelihood, and my home. No amount of harassment would make me sell. Last fall, I had to travel out of state for 3 weeks to help my daughter after she had surgery. Before leaving, I noticed surveying equipment near my property line, but thought nothing of it. The HOA was always doing landscaping projects on their side of the boundary. Big mistake. I returned to find a literal train track cutting through my eastern field, connecting the HOA's clubhouse to their newly built heritage center on the other side of my property. They'd constructed a small tourist train that would carry residents and visitors between the two attractions, right across my land. The tracks cut through my best topsoil, where I'd been growing sweet corn for the farmer's market. They'd removed nearly an acre of crops without permission and installed not just tracks but decorative lighting, benches, and signage, explaining the historic significance of Pinecrest's agricultural past. The irony would have been amusing if it wasn't my livelihood they were destroying. When I confronted Winters at the HOA office, she smugly produced paperwork claiming they had legal easement rights based on an obscure county ordinance. She said they'd sent proper notification, which I'd supposedly ignored. The certified letter had supposedly been delivered while I was away. "The train adds character to the neighborhood," she said with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "It'll increase everyone's property values by at least 15%. You should be thanking us." When I mentioned they'd destroyed my crops, Thompson chimed in from the corner of the office. "We'll compensate you for the market value of the corn. Can't be more than a few $100s. He slid a check across the table that wouldn't even cover my seed costs, let alone the lost revenue. I immediately called my lawyer, Sam, who confirmed what I suspected. Their permits were based on falsified documents. They'd doctored old property maps and exploited my absence to rush the construction through. But unwinding this legally would take months, if not years, of expensive litigation. "They're counting on you not having the resources to fight this," Sam explained. "It's a common tactic with these aggressive HOAs. They know the legal system favors those with deep pockets." That night I stood on my porch watching that ridiculous train making its first test run through my field, feeling utterly violated. The red and white cars gleamed in the sunset as they rolled through what should have been my harvest. How many more battles would I have to fight just to keep what was rightfully mine? There had to be another way to fight back. That's when I started digging through my grandfather's old records stored in metal filing cabinets in the barn. Grandpa was a meticulous man who kept documentation of every inch of our land. He'd fought his own battles with developers back in the 70s and had learned the hard way to keep impeccable records. I spent hours reviewing yellowed deeds, survey maps from the 1940s, and correspondence with the county. In the back of a drawer, I found a folder labeled Northeast Corner Dispute 1968 that caught my attention. Inside was a detailed surveyor's map with handwritten notes from my grandfather. As I studied it under the lamp at his old desk, I discovered something remarkable. The small parcel of land where the HOA had built their main office, the very headquarters from which Winters waged her war against me, wasn't actually part of the original development tract. Due to a surveying error decades ago, that quarter-acre technically belonged to our farm. Grandpa had noticed the discrepancy when the first development started, but had never pursued it since the land was just a wooded corner at that time. The documents showed that when my grandfather allowed an easement for county water lines in 1968, the surveyor had incorrectly marked our property line. The subsequent developments had used those incorrect markings, but the original deeds told a different story. I called Sam first thing in the morning and sent him scans of everything I'd found. He spent 3 days researching county records and comparing them with my grandfather's documentation. "I can hardly believe this," Sam said when he finally called back, excitement evident in his voice. "But your grandfather's records check out. Through a quirk of legal oversight when the development was first permitted, that land was never properly transferred. According to county records, that parcel still legally belongs to your family's farm." "So I own their headquarters?" I asked in disbelief, my mind racing with the implications. "According to these records, yes," he replied. "They've been operating on your land for 7 years without knowing it. The HOA built their office there in 2018, but they never did a proper title search going all the way back to the original farm boundaries." "Can we prove it definitively?" I asked, not wanting to get my hopes up. "Yes, but we need to file for a corrected survey with the county and formally establish your ownership. That will take some paperwork and filing fees, and we'll need to keep it quiet until everything's official." An idea began to form, one that would either end this conflict once and for all or escalate it beyond repair. Either way, I was tired of being pushed around. "Sam," I said, feeling a surge of determination, "let's keep this between us for now. I need time to plan this carefully." As I hung up the phone, I looked out my window at the train making another test run through my field. Instead of anger, I felt something new. The calm certainty of having finally found leverage. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what my grandfather would do in this situation. He wasn't a vindictive man, but he believed strongly in justice and community. The HOA had shown no regard for either. They'd steamrolled over my rights, destroyed my crops, and treated me like an inconvenience to be eliminated. By morning, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. It would be a gamble, but sometimes you have to risk everything to protect what matters most. If this worked, it wouldn't just solve my train problem. It might actually create something good out of this whole mess. The next morning, I was inspecting the damage to my eastern field when I saw Winters striding toward me in her tailored Navy business suit, flanked by Thompson. The red and white train cars were parked on the tracks behind them, like a garish wound across my property. "Mr. Miller," she called out, her heels sinking slightly into the soft dirt of my field. "We need to discuss the landscaping requirements around the tracks. These crops are too close to our attraction. We'll need at least a 20-foot buffer zone on each side." I stood my ground, wearing my grandfather's faded overalls, the same ones he'd worn tending this land for decades. The contrast between us couldn't have been more stark. Her designer suit against my work clothes, her corporate demeanor against my farmer's practicality. "This is private property," I said, feeling my jaw tighten. "You had no right to build anything here in the first place." Thompson stepped forward, his face reddening. "We have all the necessary permits. This train line is happening whether you like it or not." "Those permits were falsified," I countered. "My lawyer has already confirmed it." Winter's smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. "Prove it, farmer. Take us to court if you want. We have the resources to drag this out for years. Do you?" She gestured dramatically at the train behind her. "This is progress, Mr. Miller. Pinecrest is evolving into a premier community. Your quaint little farm is holding back everyone's property values. Why fight the inevitable?" Thompson chuckled. "Maybe you should sell while you still can, before we find more creative ways to make use of the surrounding land." As they turned to leave, Winters called over her shoulder, "We'll be running 6 trains daily starting next week. I'd move those crops if I were you. Oh, and do something about that tractor noise in the mornings. Some residents have complained." I watched them walk away back toward their headquarters, completely unaware they were standing on my land. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the confrontation, evidence of their trespassing that would come in handy later. "Enjoy your little victory while it lasts," I muttered, already setting my plan in motion. I needed to move carefully. Sam helped me quietly file the proper paperwork to formally establish my ownership of the office parcel. We kept it completely under wraps, paying extra filing fees to expedite the process. "This kind of title correction usually takes months," Sam warned me, "but I've called in some favors with the county clerk's office. They'll fast-track it for us." While the paperwork was processing, I visited the Veterans Rebuilding America office downtown. It's a charity I'd supported for years. They provide housing assistance and job training to homeless veterans. My grandfather had been passionate about supporting fellow veterans, and I'd continued his tradition of donating part of our harvest each year. Maria Jenkins, their director, was surprised when I asked for a private meeting. "I have a rather unusual proposition," I explained once we were in her office. I told her the whole story, the HOA's harassment, the train tracks, and my discovery about the office property. "If I were to donate a building to your organization, could you put it to good use?" I asked. Maria's eyes widened. "Absolutely. We've been looking for a new administrative space for months. Our lease is up soon and commercial rents downtown have skyrocketed." She leaned forward. "But are you sure about this? It seems like you could sell that land for a considerable sum." "I'm not interested in the money," I replied. "I want to honor my grandfather's legacy and actually do some good for the community, the real community, not just property values." With Maria on board, I next contacted Jeff, a locksmith friend who'd helped me with the farm's security after a series of thefts years ago. He agreed to be available on short notice once my paperwork cleared. The final piece was to review the HOA's own bylaws, which Winters had brandished against me countless times. I requested a copy from a sympathetic neighbor and spent an evening poring over the dense legalese. Buried in Section 12, Paragraph 7 was exactly what I needed. The association must conduct all official business from its designated headquarters as registered with the county. Another clause specified that board meetings could only be held in alternative locations during temporary emergencies not exceeding 14 days. Every night that week, I'd stand on my porch watching that train run through my field, using my anger to fuel my resolve. Each passing day brought me closer to turning the tables. I ordered a large custom banner to be printed and arranged for a photographer from the local paper to be coincidentally passing by at the right moment. When Sam called to confirm the paperwork had been processed, I felt the first real sense of victory I'd had in months. "It's official," he said. "You're the rightful owner of that parcel. I've emailed the final documentation, and the hard copies are being delivered tomorrow morning." I called Maria and Jeff, setting our plan for Saturday morning, when I knew the HOA would be conducting its monthly property inspections. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Sam asked one final time. "Once we do this, there's no going back." I thought about my grandfather, about the 3 generations of my family who had worked this land, and about the arrogance with which the HOA had dismissed it all. "I've never been more certain of anything," I replied. On Saturday morning, I arrived at the HOA office at 6 a.m. before anyone else would be around. With my paperwork in hand and the sheriff's deputy I'd arranged to be present as a witness, I met Jeff, who quickly changed all the locks on the building. "You're sure about the legality of this?" the deputy asked, reviewing my documentation one more time. "Yes, sir," I replied. "This building is on my property, and I'm exercising my rights as the legal owner." We posted the legal ownership documents and notice of donation on every door. By 8 a.m., the Veterans Rebuilding America volunteers had arrived, and we mounted large signs reading "Future Home of Veterans Rebuilding America" on the building, along with American flags and the charity's logo. Maria arrived with a dozen volunteers, all veterans in the organization's t-shirts, who began taking measurements and discussing renovation plans right on the front lawn. Some carried clipboards, others brought coffee and donuts, creating a festive atmosphere of purpose and community. By 9 a.m., when Winters typically arrived to start her weekend HOA inspection rounds, a small crowd of curious neighbors had gathered. The local newspaper had gotten wind of the generous donation to veterans and sent not just a photographer but a reporter as well. Winters' face when she pulled up in her luxury SUV was a study in disbelief. She sat frozen behind the wheel for a moment, staring at the transformed building with her mouth slightly open. Then she stormed toward the entrance only to find her key wouldn't work. When she spotted me standing with Maria and the veterans, she charged over like a bull, her designer heels clicking furiously against the pavement. "What the hell do you think you're doing? This is HOA property," she shouted, her perfectly maintained composure cracking. I calmly handed her the certified documentation. "Actually, Rebecca, this parcel has always belonged to my family. Check the surveys. I've simply decided to donate it to a worthy cause." The sheriff's deputy stepped forward. "Ma'am, I've reviewed the paperwork. It appears to be in order." As the color drained from her face, I couldn't help adding, "Perhaps next time you'll think twice before building a train track across someone else's property." Winter's face went from pale to red as she frantically paged through the documents. "This is impossible. There must be some mistake." Thompson arrived minutes later, hurrying over to examine the paperwork himself. "This can't be legal. We'll sue you into oblivion," he threatened. But I could see the worry in his eyes as he recognized the county seal on the documents. "You're welcome to try," I replied. "But while you're at it, you might want to address the fraudulent permits for that train track cutting through my property. I'm sure the county commissioner would be very interested to learn how those were obtained." The gathering neighbors began to murmur. Many were seeing Winter's tactics exposed for the first time, and they had questions of their own. One neighbor, Ellen, who'd always been sympathetic to my situation, stepped forward. "Is that true, Rebecca? You falsified permits for the train?" Winters sputtered, trying to maintain control. "It was for the good of the community. Property values—" "Cost us a fortune in HOA fees," interrupted another resident named Dave. "That train project doubled our monthly dues." "And for what?" asked another homeowner. "A tourist attraction none of us asked for?" The reporter was capturing everything, asking Winters pointed questions about both the train permits and how the HOA had failed to verify property boundaries before building their headquarters. "No comment," Winters kept repeating, but her face told a different story. Thompson pulled Winters aside, whispering urgently as the situation spiraled out of their control. She kept glancing at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Meanwhile, Maria was introducing the veterans to the neighbors, explaining their mission and how the building would help them expand their services. The mood among the residents was shifting from confusion to interest and even support. "We'll be offering job training programs," Maria explained to the gathering crowd, "and our veterans support groups will be meeting here weekly." "My son served in Afghanistan," one neighbor mentioned. "Is this program open to all veterans?" "Absolutely," Maria replied. "We're here to help every veteran in need." By afternoon, Winters had called an emergency HOA meeting at a member's house, since they no longer had an office. I wasn't invited, of course, but Ellen texted me updates. "Total chaos," her first message read. "Half the board is threatening to resign." The next update was even more telling. "They're checking financials now. Apparently, Winters spent HOA reserve funds on that train without full board approval." The local evening news ran the story of the farmer versus HOA battle, complete with footage of the veterans gratefully accepting their new building. The report included uncomfortable questions about the HOA's practices and highlighted how the train project had been pushed through without proper permits. That night, my phone rang constantly with calls from neighbors I'd barely spoken to before. Some apologized for not standing up to the HOA sooner. Others had questions about the veterans' charity. A few even offered to help restore my damaged field. The online comments section of the news story flooded with supporters congratulating me on my stand against HOA overreach. "About time someone stood up to these mini-dictators," read one comment. "God bless our veterans," read another. By Sunday morning, an emergency petition was circulating among Pinecrest residents calling for Winter's resignation and a complete audit of the HOA's finances. Thompson was nowhere to be seen, having apparently decided to distance himself from the growing scandal. As I walked my property line that evening, neighbors waved or called out greetings, something that had rarely happened before. The train sat idle on its tracks, no test runs scheduled as the HOA scrambled to address the crisis. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely on my own land. 3 days later, I received a call from Ellen, who introduced herself as the HOA's newly appointed interim president. "The board voted to remove Winters last night," she explained. "We've reviewed everything and, well, we owe you an apology, Mr. Miller. What the previous administration did was inexcusable." I let the words sink in, savoring the moment. "I appreciate that, Ellen." "We'd like to meet with you," she continued, "to discuss a way forward that works for everyone." She proposed a compromise. The HOA would immediately dismantle the train track and restore my property to its original condition, covering all expenses. In exchange, they asked if the Veterans Organization would consider leasing a portion of the building back to the HOA for essential meetings. "We're not asking for much space," Ellen explained, "just enough for our monthly board meetings and a small office for records." I discussed it with Maria, who saw an opportunity. "We could use them as tenants to help fund our programs," she pointed out, "and maybe get some of those residents involved as volunteers. Veterans need community connections as much as they need services." When we met with the new HOA board at Ellen's home, I brought my terms. First, a formal acknowledgement that my farm would never be subject to HOA rules. Second, a binding agreement that the natural boundary between my property and Pinecrest would be designated as a heritage agricultural zone that couldn't be developed or encroached upon. And third, the HOA would match every dollar of rent they paid with an equal donation to Veterans Rebuilding America. Ellen looked at her fellow board members who nodded in agreement. "Those terms are acceptable," she said, extending her hand. "We want to be good neighbors, Mr. Miller. That's what an HOA should be about, building community, not tearing it apart." The agreement was drawn up by Sam and signed the following week. Within days, crews arrived to begin removing the train tracks from my field. The HOA not only restored the damaged soil, but also compensated me for the lost crops, at fair market value this time. The veterans moved into their new headquarters by the end of the month, with the HOA occupying a small conference room and office at the back of the building. Maria reported that several Pinecrest residents had already signed up as volunteers. As spring arrived, something unexpected happened. Several Pinecrest residents approached me about starting a community garden on the border between our properties. Ellen suggested we could involve the veterans in the project as part of their rehabilitation program. "Many of our vets find gardening therapeutic," Maria explained, "and it would give them a chance to develop skills they could use for employment." We broke ground on the garden in April. To my surprise, 20 neighbors showed up with shovels and seedlings ready to work. Some brought food to share, others brought children eager to learn about growing vegetables. By summer, the garden was flourishing with a mixture of flowers and vegetables, tended by a combination of veterans and residents. My grandfather's farm is thriving again. The eastern field, now restored, yields more crops than it has in years. Each harvest, I set aside a portion for the veterans' food pantry, continuing a tradition my grandfather would have approved of. I occasionally spot Winters driving slowly past the property, glaring at the Veterans Rebuilding America sign on what used to be her office. I heard she moved to a condo downtown, no HOA. Thompson resigned from the board entirely, apparently concerned about potential legal repercussions of his role in the falsified permits. Last I heard, he was facing questions from the State Bar Association about his conduct. The train? Parts of it were donated to the local children's museum, where it's been repurposed as an interactive exhibit about agriculture and transportation. Ironically, it's now educating children about farming, something the HOA had tried to erase from the community's identity. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting what's yours, it's about reminding people what community really means. It's not about property values or perfect appearances. It's about respect, honesty, and looking out for each other. The new HOA board has taken that lesson to heart. They've revised their bylaws to require greater transparency and homeowner input on major projects. Monthly dues have been reduced to reasonable levels, and the focus has shifted to actual community needs rather than cosmetic improvements. Last week, Ellen asked if I'd consider serving as an advisory member on their community relations committee. "We need your perspective," she said, "to make sure we never lose sight of what matters again." I agreed, on the condition that our meetings include cookies from my grandmother's recipe. Some traditions are worth preserving. As for me, I sleep better knowing my grandfather's legacy continues, stronger than ever. His farm hasn't just survived, it's become the heart of a real community. The fence between my property and Pinecrest still stands, but the gates now swing open both ways. Sometimes fighting back doesn't just save your land, it builds something better in its place, and that's a harvest worth waiting for.